All righty. Well, everyone, thank you all for coming out to the Founder University Education Series, both attending online and in person. We're very excited to have you here. I believe this is our third or fourth session, and we're really excited to have a string of really excellent speakers on a number of topics that are really pertinent to founders and entrepreneurs in the various stages of their startups. Today, we're going to have Doug Harrison, who is a experienced financial professional with over 20 years in operations, finance, general management, and people development. He's going to go into founder stock, cap tables, and owner agreements, which as founders are starting to put together their venture and consider their employees, their teammates, their co-founders, these are some really, really important things that they need to get in order before they really start to scale and consider raising capital. So without much further ado, Doug, I will pass it on to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. I appreciate being here. A little bit of background. I started my financial career working for British Airways in London Heathrow Airport a long time ago. Moved to the US and got stuck into the startup world in Silicon Valley, and ended up as controller for a couple of startups, ending up as CFO for about 15 years. And then moved on to an investment bank in downtown San Francisco for about another 4 years before my wife and I decided to move out of the city and up to Reno. And I'm currently a VP finance at a drone startup here in Reno, but I have a number of other, shall we say, clients on the side that I work with, and I have done for quite some time. So moving on to the topics, when you found a company as an individual, you obviously have to go through a registration process. You have to put together things called the Articles of Incorporation. The Articles of Incorporation are actually very important, and when you start out a company, they may look very simple, but there's something that comes in later on in life that you actually have to change these, and sometimes you have to consider right from the start what sort of things you need to put in these. Anyway, the Articles of Incorporation contain things like the actual membership of the organization, like who are the owners of the corporation, how many shares of stock can they have, and what position does each of them take in the company. It has things like officers, any restrictions to management, tax distributions, transfer of membership, and all that sort of thing. The very important thing you can look at with these is how many shares are inside the actual cap table, because the shares that go into the Articles of Incorporation, let's say you put 15 million shares in there, they come out to be the authorized number of shares. And in the articles, it defines that these are the authorized and what you are able to define them as. Are they common shares? Are they Class A shares, Class A1, Class B, etc.? And you have to comply with your Articles of Incorporation before you can issue shares that are further defined. And that's what happens down the way if you go through a seed round, an angel investment round, or you go through a Series A, and you have to redefine these Articles of Incorporation. So thinking about those right from the start is very important. And then if you actually do go through financing, make sure you get to an appropriate lawyer who will let you know what needs to be done to change these according to what you're actually looking to complete. So if you look at this diagram that I have here, this reflects the stock sequence that you can have. Founder normally has common stock. Founders will usually take it at the par value as defined in the Articles of Incorporation. Par value for many companies is usually 0.001 or even 0.0001. and the founder takes whatever number of shares they feel is appropriate for them at that time. Many founders I've seen never actually pay for those shares. Partially because if you take, let's say, 1 million shares out of 10 million, and it's 0.0001, it's almost inconsequential in the size of money, because guess what? At that point, you as a founder, you're putting your hand in your pocket and you're funding the company on a bootstrap basis. You bring it up yourself. So the only risk is really your own money, and you have those common shares that are yours, and they're reflected on the cap table, and I'll show you some cap tables later. The next step in any stock sequence usually goes when you talk to your brother, your father, or Joe down the street who you've been talking to about this, and they also put money in, and they expect some sort of share position at that point, according to what you've discussed with them and what you think is fair. When you discuss that with family, it can cause problems if something goes south with the company. So you have to be well aware that it's a relationship type thing you're doing there. Sometimes it can be successful, sometimes it cannot. It depends a lot on your product, your sale, your revenue, and where you take it from there. But family and friends are very commonly involved. Family and friends can also be brought in at a later stage by being given an offering. A board can turn around and say, we would like to do a family and friends offering where it is not quite so personal. The board will authorize that through a board minute, and anybody in the company or a restricted number of people in the company can just put out a note to all of the people in their contacts list, and they can then decide who they want to send it to, and then they can offer it. It's not limited, it's not restricted, and it's not controlled in any way. But a person then can come back and say, I'd like to join this family and friends offering. Again, it would be common, and you would raise probably very little money on it. You may, if you did a family and friends round, you may determine that the value of the stock should not be par. Instead of 0.001, you might decide that it's 0.1, 10 cents a share. So you could, in fact, end up getting a little bit more money, but it would not be a huge amount. The next step here would be if you have seed investors. Seed investors are groups, or they're either companies, investment companies, or groups of individuals that come along and request a bit more preference. They are looking for they look to get in early because they know if they get in early, stock price will be low and probably very similar to a family and friends type level. So by getting in low and investing, let's say $50,000, they can get a quick 500,000 shares there if it's 10 cents. So getting in there and getting a position early on, they can use small money to take up a decent position, and then they move on to the next one. So the seed investors are, and usually you have 2 or 3 of them. They're usually small investment groups controlled by 1 or 2 people, usually fairly high net worth individuals. And as to the question that came up earlier on, how much does a seed investor get? Well, it would depend on the objectives of the board of directors of the company. Seed investors are not expecting to get board seats or anything like that. They're not expecting to get huge rights. Their biggest request is that if the company actually has a liquidity event, or if the company goes out, they would take money before common people would. So the seed investors will expect a preferred position, and it would be stated in the stock purchase agreement that they have. This is where you get a formal stock purchase agreement, the first real formal stock purchase agreement that comes and is prepared by the lawyer. Seed, there is no natural formula about what they should get in relation to their ownership position in the company. It could range from maybe 3, 5, 10%. But if you give them a lot more than that, you start to lose your leeway further down the way. Now, losing leeway means that you have to then, let's say, if you've given them 50% of the company, and then all of a sudden you're going for another financing round of some form, then you really have to go back to the lawyers and reconstruct your articles. And it might be you have to authorize additional shares. It may be that you have to, in some cases, retire some shares. There are some circumstances that can happen. But don't give them too many. They won't expect too many. They won't expect too many rights, but they are valuable in their own right. The next step there, also still in the common, comes from angels. Angels, of which StartUpNV is very familiar with. Angels are usually groups of people who have, in a lot of cases, it's retired folks or people who have sold companies and made their money along the way, who get together in groups and they can fund their money together. For example, the Desert Angels in Tucson, and there's a group of angels around the country called the Keiretsu Forum. What the Keiretsu Forum does is they will invite 5 people to present at like a breakfast. And there might be 50, I'm thinking of one in particular I was at a couple of years ago, there might be 50 or 100 people in the room all having breakfast. And then the presentations are given from like 5 to 15 minutes. And then after that, there's a discussion session broken up where people can ask individual type questions of all the people who are presenting. These angel groups can either invest as a group or they can invest as individuals. If they invest as a group, then what tends to happen is that they tend to form an investment LLC. Let's say 6 people out of 50 decide they want in on this company. They might form a little LLC between the 6 of them. Everybody puts in $20,000, and then that is the fund that was used to invest into the actual company. If they could put it into a fund beforehand, but usually it's in response to what the individual person within the angels feels free to say that that's the sort of thing I want to be in. So the angels are very, very valuable. There are a lot of them. I've been to numerous angel meetings in Silicon Valley and a couple of other places, and they are very valuable and they have a lot of money in the market. In some cases, especially at this stage of the company, when it's investment from them, they may be taking a much more senior position in the company. However, remember, it is a common stage here. The other thing they may request is actually a board seat. And if you as a founder do not want to give up a board seat, they may request then a board observer position. Board observers usually get invited to the board meetings. They have no say in what actually is decided, but they are usually very strongly involved in the discussions, and they can give their opinions. They just can't necessarily vote. Quite often that happens even when you get to preferred rounds along the way. So touch quickly here on the preferred. The preferred obviously starts off usually with an A, and it usually becomes with a VC, and you put together a pitch deck. And you've probably put one together for the angels beforehand. The seed guys don't really look too much for pitch decks. If you do a pitch deck for them, it's probably only going to be 5 to 10 pages long. But for the preferred, they're going to look for a lot more. They're going to look for the nature of the company, the nature of the market, the nature of the management staff, the nature of the current financial position, the nature of what the future is, and what's in it for them. When do I get my money back, and how much money am I going to get more than that? So when you do your pitches for a preferred, you're usually pitching to a way more sophisticated group of people. You may open up a preferred round to anybody in the common who wish to step up. And that is also a very frequent practice as well. But a preferred A usually starts off with 3 or 4, let's just say simply VCs that you've spoken to, and they decide that they might be interested. What will happen is that the VCs will get together independently. They will then decide who is going to play the lead. You will find in this circumstance that there's some VCs or family funds or sovereign funds might not like to play the lead. And the lead is usually the one who puts together the letter of intent to the company. The letter of intent says, okay, we understand your cap table. We understand how much money you've got in the bank. We understand the price of the shares. You've come to us with this, but we're only willing to pay at $1 a share, even though you've asked for about $1.50. We're only willing to put in $1, but we're prepared to put in X amount of money. And the lead guy usually is one who has a little bit more invested than the others. And the lead guy usually ends up being on the board. When you form a board at that point, you will usually have a person representing the common shares. Let's say it's a 5-person board. You'll have somebody representing the common shares. The seeds probably won't worry because they're in the common shares anyway. The preferred will definitely want a board seat. The management will have 1 or 2 board seats. And at that point, you may, on a 5 basis, you may have an independent board member who is not associated with the company, but who can bring some strength to the company, either by what he knows or what she knows, or their contacts either in the market or contacts for future financing, or contacts in the particular technology or knowledge in the technology that you're actually working in. And that would make up the constitution of a board fairly quickly. The board seats and the number are usually determined back in the agreements and the articles. And there could be 7 of them. You only appoint 5. It really doesn't really matter. It's who's voting at the time of the board meeting. And usually in some of the sections in the articles, you'll find that there is a minimum requirement of board members. And as I said, the articles are going to get rewritten at this preferred A, and it may be defined better at that stage that there is 1 from the preferred, there is 1 from the common, there are 2 from the management, there is 1 independent. But then there's 2 unfilled board seats for future action. So the VCs can put in money. Family funds, you will find a lot of those around. Family funds are comprised of usually 1 particular family, where the senior partner has made significant money through his career and maybe other prior businesses, and needs to have a vehicle to invest these funds, because he just doesn't want it sitting in Bank of America gaining no money. I just got an email this morning from a gentleman in LA saying, Douglas, I've got a pile of money sitting in Bank of America. And he said, it's not doing anything for me. Let's talk and see where we can do something for it. So the family funds guys are usually, they set up an actual office. They will have a president or a finance VP usually, and maybe 2 or 3 people. 1 or 2 of them will be the research analysts who will go out and try and find the possible opportunities. And then they will have some sort of clerical or accounting type person to take care of the day-to-day details. Sovereign funds are different. Sovereign funds come from virtually every country in the world has some form of a sovereign fund. The most common ones you hear are the ones in the Middle East. There's one called ADIA, which is Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. And they have billions. They invest in big infrastructure projects, huge infrastructure projects. They will, in some cases, invest in smaller opportunities. When I was working in the investment world, I had 2 offshore funds in the Cayman Islands, and one of them was heavily funded by a sovereign fund out of, I think it was Dubai, I can't quite remember. But the problem with a sovereign fund is you really have to know somebody to get in there. So the chance of somebody like yourselves as the founders, it's not worth the time or effort in there because it takes months, if not years. You have to go through so many hoops to get into them, and they will then defer the final decision to the #1 guy at the top of the fund. So for a preferred A, VC and family funds are probably the best thing. Now, then you move up to preferred B when you want to do another round, and it starts all over again. And when you do a B, you usually find that there's a restructuring of the complete stock system. And there's a thing in there that you can do called a pay to play. So somebody who's in the A would be offered that they can come up into the B if they want. Common people could be offered if they wanted to come up into the B. But if they don't pay, the articles can be changed at that stage, and the A can be wiped out completely and put down back into the common. They can't lose their shares, but they can lose their rights and position because of what the VCs and at the B decide that they think this they're offering to the company should be this. There's a little thing that happens usually around a B or a C. It's called a fairness opinion. And a fairness opinion is provided by an outside independent valuation person or group. Can be accountants. It can be actually individuals with usually a valuation certification. And basically what a fairness opinion is, somebody is saying, is this good for the overall rights of people in the company? And they will come in, they will interview the management, they will look at all the offerings, and then they'll say, yes, this is good, or they will say, no, we've got to give this a qualified opinion before they can do anything. So when there's a restructuring of the B, and I saw one a few years ago where the B was funded, but because people who were in the A did not step up to it, they lost all their rights and went down to common. So the point about these different steps is every time you go through a step, you can change the actual articles, and you can change where you're going with these. It depends on the circumstances at the time. It depends on a whole bunch of different things, like how much money the new guys are prepared to put in, what sort of percentage they want to own. So everything gets restructured whenever something else happens. The first two are pretty straightforward. The seed is where you start to get people saying, okay, I want a little bit more control or a little bit more feedback, etc., or a little bit more information, a little bit more preference. So that's what you get in those. Let's move on a little bit to cap table. This is a simplified cap table for a company where I've taken the names out of the columns here. The first four names here are actually founders. These others came along a little bit later and were awarded common stock at that time. So it goes common, restricted, preferred, and the total for everybody. It gives the percentage, and it gives the fully diluted shares, because there's an incentive reserve left. The incentive reserved is because the total number of shares here is if you look down the bottom, it's 18,039. That is what is sitting on the articles of incorporation as the authorized number of shares that can be issued. As I said, these four were founders. This was the original founder, the top guy. And restricted stock is very similar to a stock option type program, except you're given the stock and you actually own the stock at that time. You do not incur any tax consequences at that time. You only incur tax consequences whenever you actually sell it, or you the company gets liquidated and you get a proportion of what is yours. That, and you pay tax on the gain. So there is a recorded fair market value for this restricted stock. If it's in founder type stuff, the chances are it's a very low number, and it's probably even the same as this over here. And the objective of that was to make sure that the actual big guy founder was the key type person who owned almost half of the company. Preferred, these two lines actually, these two were seed investors, and both of them were small seed companies actually in Australia. And each of them came in, they didn't put in much money. One of them put in 50,000, the other one put in 25,000. And this is the amount of stock they picked up, 10% of the company between the two of them. And they're both associated, they know each other very well. Down here, we have some other employees along the way. And this was a special award given to somebody who worked for the company and didn't receive any remuneration as such. So it's a fairly straightforward, basic cap table. So on the other hand, we could look at this one. You can get very complicated on your stock on the cap table. This is a similar sort of format. This format, though, was actually given to me out of Pricewaterhouse probably about 25 years ago, and I've been using it ever since. A lot of people have now moved to having their cap table monitored and maintained by some form of electronic system, a company like Carta. And what Carta and those folks do is they will take your stock that you've given in stock options, they will take your common, they will take your seed, they will take every piece that you have, and they will construct a cap table essentially like this that gives you the classes of shares across the top, and then the number of stocks that people own. It gives the same here, it gives a percentage, and it will give you the fully diluted along the way. This actually is one in operation at the moment, and if you look down all the way down to the bottom, you will find that this here is an example of what I was explaining earlier on, where a B came in. The B moved the B came in and redid their stock in the articles of incorporation. And in this little cell here, people got crushed out because they didn't want to engage in the pay to play. So there is no column here for an A round. The A round was wiped clean. However, there are a significant number of investors in here, but if you see, there's probably what, 50 investors in this column. In here, there's probably another 60, 70 investors. And down here, this is a current offering that this company was going through. And there was the number of shares that were actually issued, issued at that time. At the bottom, we have other things going on. We have some warrants. Warrants are very, very common. Easy ways to do things and easy ways for people to ask for to be rewarded. The 65,000 there is actually a warrant to a bank. Because let's say a bank loans you $5 million in an operating money, they will most often ask for a warrant for shares. A warrant usually lasts about 5 to 10 years. And if, let's say you then pay that 5 million back, the warrant will probably expire at that point, and you can write that into the warrant. So a warrant is a way of giving shares to people that have value. And once they get these shares, they do have to buy them, but they don't have to buy them up front. Back in the late 90s and all into the year 2000, it was very common when you went in San Francisco, if you would go and try and rent a building or rent space in a building, the landlord would ask for a warrant because everybody was going public in 99, 89, or 99, 98, 99. Everybody was going public and making lots of money off their stock awards, stock options, and off of the actual going public, that the landlord wanted in on the deal because they wanted to make an extra little piece. So warrants are common ways of handling things, and they're also common ways of handling things if you've got plenty stock on your authorized that you haven't issued, because you can use that as a way to have some leverage. Quite often, if you want to pay a consultant, for example, I've seen warrant being given to a video company to do publicity videos, and you probably have to, and they'll say their bill is $10,000. It may be you can negotiate that it would be 5,000 in cash and 5,000 in warrant equivalents at X price. Below that here, we've got some outstanding options because there's probably, behind this number, there's probably 7 years of stock options that people have vested in that period. And then there's the same stock options that are unvested. These have to be kept separate for some accounting purposes I won't bore you with, but you have to make sure that you know the difference. This one here, we do the CEO, and that is purely for optics along the way. And then I have a pool here of unissued options. So you hire another 10 people, and you want to give them 10,000 shares each. That would come out of that pool and be held separately. So, and along the bottom, you see a whole bunch of different tabs here that all roll into this central one. It's a fairly complicated piece, and it can get very tight. This particular one, I reconcile usually every month with the individuals, and I can logically say that it works pretty well, but I'm getting to the point where I can't handle 175 individual investors and probably 7 years of stock options without being absolutely accurate at it. So I'm going to have to move this whole one over onto a system of some form like Carta, as I was talking about. Okay, let's just move on a little bit to owner agreements. So when you form the company, you will have articles of incorporation, you will have bylaws, and you can have an owner's agreement. An owner's agreement is very critical. So the articles of incorporation form the legal and statutory requirements of incorporating the company and forming it and having it able to legally go. Every company also has bylaws, which are not necessarily statutory required. The pieces in the bylaws are often pieces about how do we run the company, and are we going to go, what's the intention along the way? Do we try to go public, or what it is? It's more of a how we run the company. The owner's agreement is different and should actually be done very, very carefully beforehand. And there's a definition here in the middle called a buy-sell agreement. A buy-sell agreement is usually between the 1, 2, 3, or 4 key owners who formed the company. And it says here, the goal is to keep all the owners on the same page about running the company and deciding what happens when one leaves. That's got nothing to do with bylaws. It's got nothing to do with the articles of incorporation. And this statement here makes it fairly clear. Bylaws are necessity, just like operating agreements, but the actual agreements between that are in the pieces that are in the bylaws will not determine, like when Bill and Fred decide that they don't get on very well together. And if you don't have a proper owner's agreement that is defined for stuff like that, it can get you in trouble quite often. Other pieces here are you need to plan for unexpected events. What happens if somebody gets sick and can't operate? Do they stay part of the company? Is there a divorce, a disability? What happens if Alice, who's the key person who's running as a COO, Alice can't work anymore because she's been in a car accident? So if she can't work anymore, does she stay on the books? Is she allowed to stay for medical purposes? If so, do we have to pay her at least minimum wage, and otherwise she wouldn't be defined as an employee and be eligible under a company medical plan? So there are things in here that you need to think about, and it has to be a very clinical way of thinking, because it's not like you're trying to blame each other, because if Alice has a car accident, so could Joe. So you're both on equal terms, or the 3 of you or 4 of you are on equal terms at that point. And you have to decide that since we're all on equal terms, everything is fair game. We can talk about anything. We can consider all the unwanted possibilities and write them down, or write down a process of how we would solve it if there was something unwanted happen. The other thing is you need to protect the business itself. It could be that you have somebody who has actually put some money in their pocket. You could have somebody who is doing side agreements with a supplier and receiving, let's call it a commission. What happens in those sort of situations? And you need to protect the business. And if you don't have these agreements in place, it can be difficult. I had one situation about 10 years ago where there were 2 partners and did not have an agreement like this. Both partners had other business interests, and there was one key partner who was running this business, and the other partner was doing his other one, which was becoming more and more lucrative, and did nothing for this business. So, but because there was a relationship, the partner that wasn't doing anything, he had a real good relationship with the number one client. And the number one client turned around and said, well, okay, if I'm not going to stay with you guys anymore, I'm going to go off somewhere else. Net result, they lost about half of their business and the company went under. You avoid deadlock because there will be disagreements. How do you solve a disagreement? Sometimes it can be to the stage where the business, as I just described, if the partners don't get on, then if there's one who has a critical hold of a part of the business and decides to go a different direction, that can often mean that the business goes under. So what do you do if one says one thing and one says the other? And then you need to say what the owners are allowed to and what they're not allowed to do. Because every company is different, every owner is different, and you have to define what their specific roles are and the expectation of those roles. You don't have to go into huge details about it, but it helps if the owners are understanding that I'm in charge of operations, I'm in charge of supply chain, that sort of thing. And you can all meet together, et cetera, but if you spell out the expectations right from the start, then people have an understanding of what they're supposed to do. So you can remove former employee owners. So let's say, I'm thinking of another company where it was principally formed by two young men, and it's actually here in Reno, but one of them was an Australian guy and decided he wanted to move back to Australia, get married, and pursue a different career. So how do you remove a key player? If he's completely vested in his stocks, you have to keep him in his stock. However, are there any rights that he would have along the way? How do you take him off the board? How long does he continue? Should he continue as an advisor on an advisory board? If so, what would the terms of the advisory board be? Should he continue on a consulting board, a consulting basis? And if so, then what would his hourly rate be? What would his expectations be for that in number of hours, but also from the point of view of work product? So you'd have to determine what the work product there would be for that. So if there's a buyout, what is the arrangements around that? Let's say the buyout comes in and somebody says, I don't think it's worth 20 million. I'm going to offer you 10. And one owner says yes, one owner says no. Do you both agree, or do you can't go back to the buyer because the buyer, he said, I'm not paying 20, I'm only paying 10. But one of you says, yes, I want to take the 10. And the other one says, no, I don't want to take the 10. Then you might suffer from that along the way if you don't cash out along the way to the right owner. And the last one here is you have to make sure you follow the state's rules. A lot of companies have obviously are incorporated in Delaware, and Delaware is fairly liberal along their rules. Another state like Nevada is fairly liberal in the rules also. But you want to make sure that if there's anything that is particular to the state's rules between partners, you need to include at least some reference to that. Like in Nevada, you would refer it to some of the NRS rules along the way. And that would that would help in the point of view of an agreement between partners. So I have got to roughly the end here and would like to see if there's any particular questions I could take.
The first question, I believe you addressed this is if a startups receive seed funding, how much of the stock is reasonable to give to the vendors? And I believe you addressed that earlier, correct?
Correct. And I showed you on one of the cap tables.
Yeah, excellent.
Seed investors ended up about 10%.
Okay. How many times can the share pool be revised?
So in the articles of incorporation, there's a section there that gives the number of shares that are authorized. It then breaks down what kind of shares they are. Are they common shares? Let's say it's a 15,000 authorization, and you say 15 million authorization. You say 10 million can be common, and 5 million shall be reserved for future investment by outside persons. And then it would say of the 10 million, 2 million of those can be reserved for a stock option plan. Stock option plans range from 15% of the authorized up to about 20% of the authorized. I've seen a couple more going slightly over that, but not much more than about 22%. What you have to remember about those is when you put in a stock option plan, it is not necessarily owned. So the persons show up on that big one I showed you, they would show up not in the ownership, but under the last column, which was fully diluted. The ownership is only the people who have actually purchased shares. So the stock option plan, you could set aside inside the articles, you can set aside and say 22 million of the 10 million common shall be designated to be for the stock option pool. You can revise that at any time by a board amendment, which then has to be carried forward into the actual articles. If there is no reference in the articles for a stock option plan and stock option number, or what you would put in there is the company reserves the right to issue stock options at a board determined level within the company, which may vary at any time, which may be varied by the board at any time. So if you put in some language like that, the board could carry on issuing options, but issuing them, as I said, then doesn't mean to say the ownership's there. Now, if an owner, when you do an option is usually, it can be, the most common way is what's called cliff vesting, where the option is given for, let's say, 10,000 shares, of which the period of vesting is 4 years, and the cliff vesting starts after 1 year. So even though you've given them the actual 10,000 shares of options, they don't actually have the right to exercise until after the first year. And usually at that point, it would be a 25% of the actual award. So at the end of 1 year, a person who was given the option would have the rights to buy at a specified price 2,500 shares of the company. They don't have to. It is their decision. And there's usually a tie-up period where they can continue this right. And in most cases, that's 10 years. And if they don't exercise it within that 10 years, then they lose it. So in that particular example, somebody who had 10,000 shares would cliff vest 4 of them afterwards. So 2,500 after 1 year, and then it would be usually monthly thereafter until they reach their 10,000. Then nothing happens to that particular offer, and it goes on and on the books as a vested offer. And I showed you that earlier on the large cap table, that I showed some were vested, some were not. And that's quite often, that's the difference there. Now, when you have stock options like that, there are some significant accounting processes around them, but they get complicated, and that's for folks like me to handle for people. Don't forget then, you have, let's say you got 50 employees, you've given out stock options to them all. Some of these employees are going to leave. When they leave, they're usually given a period of which they're allowed to exercise any of their vested options, and it's usually 90 days. If they don't, then that option gets cancelled, and those shares go back into the available pool. So initially, if you can get it, you feel as if you're getting too high and too close to the top of the pool, and then all of a sudden Fred, Wilma, Alice, and Joel all leave the company, you're back off from the top. So there's a turnover of people who leave the company, and therefore the shares can go up and down according to what your turnover of people are. Does that help?
Gotcha. Thank you. So it can be revised several times, just depending on a number of factors at this point.
Yep.
All right. How does one find an independent board member? Who finds him or her, the founders or the investors?
It can be both. Usually what happens is, if you've got an investor, then the CEO would get together with the key investor and they'd talk about it. And they usually, if it's a key investor, he's been around the world long enough that he knows people. He has a network. He would then recommend probably somebody to the CEO. The CEO would probably then take a look at some bios, do some backgrounds, and I've actually got one exact process handling right now as we speak for an independent director. And we had to research the bio of a particular gentleman, and he can come straight from the CEO. The CEO could do a complete recommendation. Obviously, it would have to be ratified by the board, no matter where it comes from, but it's mainly through networking. An interesting way of doing it would be networking in your same field. If you're in biotech, you could network in some of the small startup biotech companies, or you would network around places like Y Combinator, which is an incubator in the Bay Area, or you would network around StartUpNV, who have contacts here in Nevada fairly well. But the actual person can come from anybody and anywhere with no real problem.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Who is more interested in the fairness opinion, the new investors or the founders / current investors?
You might call the fairness opinion a way of covering your ass. Because it is essentially the owners, the founders, who are bringing in new money, and therefore the old money is being diluted. Now, if I'm an old money shareholder and you bring in some new money and my percentage of the company goes down from 2% to 1%, I might not be happy at that. So the people in the company, the management of the company, as a process would say, we want to make sure that we are doing the right thing by all shareholders, and that this deal is in fact a fair one, considering considering where the company is going in the future. So the guy who does the fairness opinion would look at the financial structure, look at the plan for the future, the needs for capital, the type of new investors that are coming in. And even though the old money was getting diluted, if they say it's fair, then that means the management have done their proper due diligence to ensure that the best interests of the company and the other shareholders have been taken care of.
Gotcha. Thank you. Next question. If we haven't set an owner's agreement in place, but we have already filed our articles of incorporation in Delaware, can we bring this out later, or does it need to be set prior to incorporating?
An ownership agreement doesn't have to be filed with anybody. It is a personal agreement between all of you. It can be signed, notarized, etc., just to make sure that everybody has a copy. But it doesn't have to be filed with any state or agency or federal agency. Sorry?
Well, I was going to ask, are there implications on its legal enforceability if it's not filed anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Next question. Curious to your thoughts on when to begin fundraising in general. Stated another way, at what point have you seen founders transition from bootstrapping to fundraising?
There are stages in the company that you have. You have a foundation stage where you've set up your company, you've filed your articles, you've put your $10,000 in the bank, and you think, okay, it's now time to go and work the product. You've got your premises. You need to start hiring people and then get them to work. When you move them into that stage, that is called a development stage company. And a development stage company is one where you're producing what the company is intended to do, a drug or a piece of a widget of some form, but you don't necessarily have sales at that point. And then you get to the end of your $8,000 because you've hired 2 or 3 people, and all of a sudden you need some money. The decision point for money is a couple of things. It's one, how close am I getting to my bank account where I haven't got any more money in it? And how easy is it for me to get it from somebody else? I have another company here in Reno. It's been around for 28 years, but it's been kept alive by personal money from the CEO only. So the company ends up owing him through the years many hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he hasn't gone out and got funding. He's in the process of trying to work that, but he hasn't gone out and got funding at all because he kept putting his own money in. So when you need to go for funding, it also depends on what your own personal commitment is, your own personal depth of pocket is, and your own commitment to the product and to the likelihood of sales coming along. If you then turn around and sell the product, then you end up going into the next stage, which is revenue stage. Revenue stage makes it much easier to raise money. If you've got customers and your customers are growing, then people will fund you very easily. There's another company here in Reno I'm aware of that had 0 revenue one year and the following year had 3.5 million. So they will get funding without any trouble. I have another company, I might mention them earlier, some guys out of LA. 4 or 5 years ago, they had $50,000 in revenue. Last year, they had 7.5 million. And they had an extremely healthy bottom line. So the catch there is they don't need money because of their healthy bottom line. So they bootstrapped it up themselves to the point now where the company is probably worth 20 million and they're adding another stream to it, which if it's successful, and I have no doubt it will be, would probably take the company up to about $100 million of valuation. So when do you go for it? It depends on your own personal objectives. It depends on your product. It depends on your likelihood of sales. And people will look at your plan and look and see if it is likely before they will actually give you money. So if you've got 10,000 and you're prepared to put in another 100,000 yourself, then you don't need to go out for money at that point. So it's a very personal and internal thing. And the other point is founder ownership percentages. Founders don't like to give up control. And everybody thinks, okay, 50% is it, 50% is it, 50% is it. In the year 2000, I was with a company in San Francisco where three founders, each of them had 3% of the company. The rest was owned by outside preferred stockholders, probably 75 stockholders. So that also is a key to saying, how do I do this? Where am I going? Where's my tolerance here? Because if you're going to give up 60, 70% of the company, then somebody may be more interested in putting in money because effectively they take control. They become in control of the board. They become in control of the decision making. So, okay, if I'm in control, why shouldn't I be happy to put more money in? An organization here, a mining organization here that's got a particularly strong land claim out in Winnemucca, and the guy that owns the company, he's prepared to give up 40%, 45% of the company if somebody will give him 10 million to help him develop it. So there's a whole bunch of things come into play here. There's no firm decision point.
Gotcha. Thank you. I'm going to piggyback off that question to this next one. So in a scenario that you described, I think first there, where a founder has been putting in a lot of their own money through the years and now are just barely starting to consider raising capital. Will he have to disclose that when he's seeking, would he be trying to pay himself back in some form or fashion? And will he have to disclose that to the investors when he raises the capital?
Okay. Depends on how he puts the money in. If he's put $100,000 in, how does it show up on the balance sheet? Does it show up as shares or does it show up as a loan? There are two or three ways to take money out. The caveat about taking money out is that during a financing round, me, Joe investor, I don't want to give you another $100,000 if you're going to spend it putting your own money back. Putting it back in your own pocket. I had that situation in Pleasanton, California, about 12 years ago, where the CEO had raised $600,000, but he'd already put a lot of his own personal money in. So when that $600,000 came in, he started to pay himself at a much higher rate. And the two guys that put in the 600,000 were not happy. And eventually that totally destroyed the company because nobody else would come along and put any money in. So every situation is different here. So putting money in is a very difficult situation for the founder, because you don't know when you're going to get it back. You're gambling, you're betting on yourself, you're betting on your product, you're betting on your people. And when you ask for money, there should be no expectation of you getting it back. So you should be having it in and as stock probably. But if you don't want to have it as stock, it would show on your balance sheet as a loan payable back to you. But then me as Joe investor, when I look at the balance sheet and I'm going to say, okay, what's this loan for? And if it's a loan from me, from you to the company, I'm going to get suspicious because I'm going to say, is my money going to be properly used? So you can take money, you can get money back if you've loaned it to the company. You can take money back as salary wise if you increase your salary, and you can take money back by a return of capital, but that would then dilute your own personal shares. So those are the three principal ways to take money out of the company. So you wouldn't necessarily want to be showing that you're taking it back from capital, or you don't want to show you're taking it back as a loan. So the only place to really place it to give yourself the hope of raising money from an investor would be on the balance sheet as shares.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that we will close this session now. Doug, thank you so much for your time here. It's been very informative, and there's a lot. This is a pretty complex topic, and so I know that a lot of founders came into this session seeking good resources, and I'm sure they found it. So appreciate your time.